Those who know our work, which is to do with civil liberties in the European Union, won't be surprised that most of my talk is trying to put what is happening in the European Union context. Although I'm going to start off by looking at the UK, or using the UK as an example. Surveillance of opposition and dissent is as old as the state. It was in 1657 that the Royal Mail Act gave the monopoly to the monarchy of the post office, and it spelt out the reason for this. It says, excuse me, quote, "It was to discover and prevent any dangerous or wicked designs against the Commonwealth," meaning the empire. So there always have been targets who have been foreign powers, the external enemy, and subversives who seek to change society, the enemy within. So what is happening now, in a sense, is not new. What is new is the political base, the legal base, and the possibility of how you can use and misuse technology. So what I'm going to talk about first, putting it in a European context, I'm going to use examples in a minute by looking at the gatherers, the users, the suppliers, and the targets. But first of all, I want to say that you're not going to understand what is happening, not just out of Snowden, but out of the surveillance society, the police and security state developments, the security industrial complex, unless you not just see our own state and other states in Europe, but understand what is happening at European Union level. So my contention is that at European Union level, we have seen since 1993, since the Maastricht Treaty, where the political followed the economic of the 1986 Single European Act, state building. It's quite a legitimate concept of state building. States don't appear overnight. They built up, and they're either held back or they emerge and they solidify. So I would argue that since 1993 we've seen state building in the European Union. Now, academic theorists, right across the field of many academic disciplines, would say there cannot be an EU state for a simple reason, because it does not have a monopoly of coercive power. This, they say, coercive power is still held and exercised by national member states. Well, that's been around for a long time, and in a sense, academics have accepted that and not challenged it, in my view, enough. I'm just going to have a drink. Because I don't think you can look at state power these days just in terms of coercive power. Sure, they've got coercive power. But you also have to look at what's called soft power. Soft power through surveillance and enforcement technology. That is also about the use of power. How does it work? Well, in simple terms, things don't change in our streets. We still have our, if you've still got the money for them, community bobbies, you've still got the police responding to emergencies at the national level in local communities. But there's another level which has been slowly peeled off, where anything in the EU involves more than one member state, i.e. UK and one other member state, or any other 2 or 3 member states, then increasingly the EU is becoming the relevant arena for deciding what is to be done, providing a perspective for operations. So what we've got at the EU level already built up is the Schengen Information System 2, Visa Information System, which we have to register before they're allowed to enter the United Kingdom and the rest of the member states, Eurodac, fingerprinting of asylum seekers, PRUM, the exchange of data on DNA, fingerprints and vehicle data. We've got the proposed, Eurosur is almost up and running, although it doesn't entirely do much good in the Mediterranean. EU Pnr is on the table, which by the look of it, thanks to the UK, is not just going to include people coming in and out of the EU, but have the option to actually track travel between EU member states, and we know that under the table they want to track travel actually within each member state. We have at another level harmonised laws. They call it harmonised through the Council of Justice and Home Affairs Ministers. But what they increasingly got involved in is operations. The Council in particular is time and time again in the documents that we're seeing mounting reporting on operations. Last year there was a big operation which we exposed in advance, which led to a lot of action around Europe, for a European-wide operation to track down and stop and apprehend undocumented migrants in streets, on buses, on trains, not just at the borders. Some 96,000 people were apprehended. They don't describe what happened to people apprehended. Were they stopped and recorded? Were they taken to detention? Were they sent back home? Were they detained? No, they were just apprehended. We've got no more information than that. So I believe what is happening at this moment in time in the EU, we're at a tipping point where the EU state, for those who want to see it, is going to develop ever faster. I want to quickly try and summarise the European perspective, as I would put it, by a play on a well-known Gramscian quote and adapting it. So it would read like this: the EU state arbitrates in the interests of capital as a whole, both economically and politically, resolving, harmonising differences between competing individual capitalists. But importantly, it also mediates between competing member state interests to advance the neoliberal agenda. While the repressive and surveillance capacities of the EU are being built up, it is the ability of the EU state and its power elites to influence and shape the perceptions of the people as to the legitimacy of the EU and the futility of resistance. So that is my view about the context of work in the European state. Now I want to look at directly in terms of the Snowden revelations and surveillance and the whole history since 2001. Most attention at the moment is quite rightly put on the gatherers. Those are the people who are gathering the information, whether it's GCHQ or NSA or the Five Eyes. That is very important to do. But what we have to also look at, if we understand the trail, whether it's as researchers or investigative journalists or whatever, is down. And the next step we look at is who is using that data, that intelligence. In the main, it's the CIA, FBI, Drugs Enforcement, Department of Homeland Security, MI5, MI6, Defence Intelligence Special Branch, who are using it against targets. And then you've got the suppliers, the people who supply the technology for that gathering, and then also the technology for enforcement of the measures put in place against individuals or indeed whole populations. And suppliers are the multinational companies, because they have their own need to gather information on their own people who use their services, and they sell that data to other people, and they sell that data to the state, or they transfer it to the state. But they're also the people that sit down in the rooms and the meetings and the commission to say, what kind of security research are we going to do? Are saying, oh, well, let's give £25 million on this particular project. Is it a good idea to record the conversations of everybody on an aeroplane, for example? That's just a test. And there's great problems, in fact, in getting any concept of data protection or privacy written into, and Statewatch and others like PI and others have tried to get this written into how the EU actually says we're going to even think about a project or award money for a contract. And many of the companies, who've been part of the should we launch the project, are the people who get the money in the end to carry out the actual project itself. And of course it's important, because if you've got that technology and you can capture the market within the EU, you've then got a base, in fact, to market that technology around the world. So there's an embedded relationship between the users and the suppliers, which is very well described and started to be described by Ben Hayes in the Neo-Canopticon, which I'm glad to tell you we've now got a grant for 3 years to update the Neo-Canopticon, looking at the security industrial complex in the European Union. So finally at this point, I've got 2 more points now. This is the penultimate one. I want to look at the targets. Who are the targets of the users? I'm sure there are more than I'm going to mention. Well, the first and obvious targets are suspected terrorists, and there are suspected terrorists, which is quite legitimately. The problems we all know is when there's function creep and it widens out in anybody who's showing any kind of sympathy to terrorism. There is a classic thing which went through 2 or 3 years ago, and it's called soft law in the European Union. It's called a council conclusion, which is an enabling power to make legitimate. And this is a means between special units and security agencies around the EU on radical messages. There's 78 questions, whether that's an individual or a group. And the scope of this is, and I'm quoting here directly, is extreme right, extreme left, Islamists, nationalists, and anti-globalization, etc. That is the scope. That is blatant function creep, clearly. And of course, we've got our own Prime Minister in the UK, who declares, together with the Home Secretary, it's no longer good enough to be a law-abiding citizen, just to obey the law. You've also got to subscribe to British values, which is very bizarre when you think of the term British values. It means they're excluding Northern Ireland as being part of this process. No concept, because it should be the same in the UK. So that is the problem with the function creep. What you also get is the second targets, of course, and it's blatantly obvious, are people who are refugees and asylum seekers. Well, better example we've had this year than the reactions of governments particularly the UK government, which was not denied by other member states, was saying, if we rescue people in the Mediterranean, we'll only encourage more people to come. But of course, when they do come, they can be checked out against, before they're given the right of asylum and the right to remain, with the countries they've come from, with the agencies they've come from, under Resolution 1373 of the United Nations. This means, in effect, people are being checked back from the very state they've been fleeing from. There's also extraordinary when they find that they've got many asylum seekers in the European Union, and say, people don't... I actually sat in a meeting this year where the Commission official said to the European Parliament, the problem is people don't want to go back to the countries they've come from. And he seemed surprised. And of course it is very important at the moment because we've had this pathetic response by the European Union to stop people coming in, and they've been talking about figures of 5,000, 20,000 and 40,000. Now they've dropped it back down to 20,000, and thank goodness last week the UN came out and said, come off it, Europe, you can take 1 million. And they're quite right. The third category of targets are the migrant communities. We've had studies in Britain, there's studies in Germany and other countries about migrant communities, particularly Muslim communities, become the target of surveillance, the target of infiltration, the target of undercover officers, the target of recruiting covert human information sources to spy on their own communities. That perverts the political and social life of those communities. And then, of course, you have just normal democratic activity. We have a definition of domestic extremism, which goes from terrorists, criminal activity, through to people, the activities of groups, and I'm quoting here from the definition, which the government refuses to change, even though the police want to change the definition. This government, the last government, this one says they will not change it. The activities of groups or individuals who commit or plan serious criminal activity motivated by political or an ideological viewpoint. That has allowed the police to see demonstrations and protests and defence campaigns as part of domestic extremism. But the government won't change it, even though the police want to change it. Indeed, they have a definition of extremism they're trying to do now, of non-violent extremism. We had the Chief Counsel of Greater Manchester coming out and saying, sorry, we're not the thought police, you've got to tell us how you define extremism. And it's not just a question for the police, it's a question for people in universities and people in schools. How do you define what is extremism? What is going over what line? That is the big issue. Second, I think down the fifth one, of course, is as old as capitalism. It's people who rebel, people who riot when there's poor times and we have austerity. Where we have societies, not just in the UK, but across Europe, where you have what I would call the precariat. They are skilled people with no chance of a job. Or the underclass who have got no skills and no chance of a job. That, of course, is what they see as a potential threat for riots, riot being a political act. Then you have cross-border protests. I won't go into this, but there's massive planning. Every time there's a cross-border protest, where it's G6, Copenhagen, 6 months forward planning goes in to track down people, target people when they're there, liaison officers go over, people are picked out on the spot. There's a whole strategy there in place, being enacted, coordinated at the EU level. And of course the other target, the final target, is everybody who lives in the European Union, because we're all suspects. I mean, mandatory retention is apparently unlawful from 2006 when it was adopted, and what does the Commission do? The Commission sits on its hands, the Council sits on its hands, and leaves every member state to carry on doing what they want to do. Of course, one of the first to react and make lawful what was unlawful is the United Kingdom government, under Dripper. But I mean, this is pathetic reaction by the main institutions of the European Union. What I lastly want to get into is some of the more difficult points, the good points and the difficult points. I mean, I think what we have seen, and we've had discussion early on today, the reaction in the United States may not have been perfect, but at least there's been a debate, at least there's been a proper discussion, at least there's been serious proposals rejected and voted on in Congress, and changes. At least that has happened for everybody to see. At least the courts have really got involved. At least you've got a Freedom Act, which is slightly better. I know that, but remember, sorry, but it still leaves in the fact that the United States can spy on the rest of the world. It has not removed the spying on the rest of the world, which NSA can do. And also GCHQ is also allowed to spy on the rest of the world. It doesn't take a lot of common sense to realise that the US NSA cannot spy on its own citizens. GCHQ is not meant to spy on its own citizens, but if they can spy on each other, sure as hell they can exchange information as much as they want to. Now, getting around to the nitty-gritty, it has been pathetic of the silence of the institutions of the Council and the Commission on this issue. The same thing happened when we had the CIA rendition. Right? They would not give any, they wouldn't get involved. They wouldn't want any reaction. And now we've got the EU-US agreement being discussed, on which we're going to do a big report, in fact, in about a month's time. Now I want to get into the difficult side, because I've talked about the targets, but there are some more difficult targets which we've seen taken up in addition by very courageous lawyers in Britain and other countries. From the minutes of the, I'm now referring for documents which are not public documents, which we have obtained, most of which are either online or will be going online. The report of the counter-terrorism coordinator, reporting on a meeting of the 12th of February on counter-terrorism, on implementation, it says, there is deepening cooperation of member state security services, and their cooperation takes place outside of EU structures. When it says it takes place outside EU structures, it means it's taking outside of any concept of accountability. How do we know what they're doing? How do we know what they're planning? And in a sense, I now want to allude to that. There is a power within the treaty, Article 71 of Lisbon, for security to cooperate together. But they're clearly cooperating together, which we know they've had meetings at that level, but they're also cooperating outside of EU structures as well. And this is the difficult thing. Since it's the role, in part, the role being given to Europol. As a reaction to what's happened with ISIS, Europol has been given new roles and functions, but with no underlying basic legal basis. They've been given those orders by the Council, that's the governments, not by the Commission, not by the Parliament. They've been given them by the Council. This includes gathering lists of people who are suspected or foreign fighters. Now, I'm sure there are a lot that are genuine. Over 5,000 being collected by the end of February. They're all being handed into Europol to distribute around the European Union to watch out for these foreign fighters. Now, I'm sure a lot of these are legitimate targets. The problem is, let us think back a minute, hang about a minute. After 2001, with Al-Qaeda, we had this concept of the sanctions list. There's the EU sanctions list, US sanctions list, UN sanctions list. Very differently, but fought hard in the end, that at least there was some mechanism for appeal. But we're entering a process here where people are on lists being circulated around the European Union with no mechanism at all, either now or in the future. Now remember that when you have one foreign fighter, in intelligence terms, it's not just one person you gather information on, it is their friends and their families and their contacts and their social life and their political life. That is all one file. All that file can be transferred. So if you've got 5,000, it isn't 5,000 names, it can be 30, 50,000 names going around the European Union. It all goes back to 2003 when they passed a directive on counter-terrorism which said you must pass the names over the minute you've arrested somebody to all the other member states. There's nothing in that directive saying that if those people are not charged or found to be innocent, you've got to remove that intelligence trail, that watch list trail. That's underway. So yes, I am finishing. The other thing they're doing, which again I will be writing about, is something that was passed in 2002, which was highly controversial in the member states for creating ad hoc multinational teams who would act outside of the criminal process and place under surveillance suspected groups. They have now just reactivated that without any legal basis whatsoever. So what I'm saying is we've not got to just look at the targets, we've got to look at the people who get caught up who shouldn't be there. We've got to demand there is a level of accountability there, and that's a responsibility not just for journalists and NGOs, but also for all activists, including academics. Thank you.